What do most people get wrong when it comes to understanding communication, do you think?
I think what most people get wrong is they think that it's something that should just happen naturally, right? That it's something that the best communicators are people who don't think about communication. But what we've discovered is exactly the opposite. If you know someone who is just fantastic at connecting with people, at communicating, and you go up and you ask them, have you always been like this? Inevitably, what they're going to tell you is no. They'll say something like, when I was in high school, I had real trouble making friends. And so I really had to study how kids talk to each other, or my parents got divorced when I was a kid and I had to be the peacemaker between them. The thing about communication is it's just a set of skills. It's not even particularly complicated skills. It's a set of skills that anyone can learn. Anyone can become a super communicator, but you have to realize that they're skills and you have to practice them a little bit. And you have to commit to thinking about how you communicate to get better at it.
I suppose communication is quite tightly tied to our sense of self. It's our expression of who we are. So when we look at somebody that's a good or a bad communicator, that's because they're a good or a bad person. What was the sense of self-worth comes through as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that happens a lot. And of course, you can be a bad person and be a great communicator. You can be a good person and not be a great communicator. But you're exactly right that communication is very central to not only how we think about ourselves, but how we move through the world. And what's interesting is if you think about it, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, right? It is the thing that has allowed us to be, do better than every other species, to build families and villages and towns, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next generation. And so our brains have evolved to be pretty good at communication. Like we have all of the stuff in our head to be fantastic at it. And as a result, because it's so important to who we are as a species, you're right. We tend to judge people like their moral worth on whether they're a good communicator or not. And that can be a little bit dangerous, but it also means that if you want to connect with someone and you're someone who's an introvert, you're someone who has trouble connecting, it's really just a matter of learning these skills about how communication works, and you can form that bond.
Talk to me about the difference between introverts and extroverts. Are there advantages and disadvantages that each have? It's sort of off the top of your head, you'd think, well, extroverts have got all of the advantages here because they're the ones that are more outgoing. They're going to have more experience. They're going to find social engagements less energy sapping. What did you come to learn about extroverts and introverts in communication?
So it turns out, to answer that question, let me tell you a little bit about what we know about the science of communication. So when I started writing Supercommunicators, the reason why is because I had fallen into this bad pattern with my wife, which probably is going to be familiar to you and anyone listening to this, which is I would come home from a long day of work. I'd start complaining about my day. I was working at the New York Times at that point. Be like, my boss doesn't understand me and my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife would say this very practical thing. She would say why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear her good advice, I would actually get more upset, right? And I would say you're supposed to be supporting me. You're supposed to be on my side. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. It was not a good scene, right? And I think many people, all relationships have some version of this where one person wants to complain and the other person wants to solve the problem, and there's conflict there. And so I was trying to figure out why this was happening. And I went to researchers and I asked them, and they said, well, we're actually really glad that you came and talked to us right now because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication. And one of the things that we've learned by studying the brains of people as they communicate with each other is that when you're having a discussion, you think it's about one thing, right? You're talking about your day or where to go on vacation or next year's budget. But actually, they said, if you look at someone's brain, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And in general, these conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're solving problems or making plans together. But then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and society. And they said, what we've discovered is if two people are having different kinds of conversations at the same time, they usually aren't even aware of it, but they literally can't hear each other. They literally can't understand what the other person is trying to say, and they don't feel connected at all. But if you can figure out what kind of conversation is happening, and you can match the other person or invite them to match you, then suddenly you feel connected. Even if you don't agree with each other, you suddenly feel like you have some type of connection, and it feels like a conversation. So what does this have to do with introverts and extroverts? A lot of the research that's coming out, particularly now, says that introversion and extroversion is not necessarily something that we're born with or something that's hardwired into our brain. It's a set of habits that we become comfortable with, right? Extroverts oftentimes get more opportunities to practice having conversations, such as emotional conversations, right? Or practical conversations. Or because they have practice, somebody comes up to them with an emotional problem and they try and give them a practical solution and it doesn't go well. And they say, okay, next time I'm going to handle this a little bit differently. I'm going to do better. I think one of the big differences between extroverts and introverts is simply how much time and space we have and we give ourselves to practice. Because like anything that's skills-based, the first time you play soccer, the first time you play cricket, the first time you go and lift weights, you're not great at it. You got to practice it. You got to learn how to do it. And communication is exactly the same way.
What would you consider the component skills of communication if you were to bucket them together?
Okay, so there's a couple of them. And we should talk about what a supercommunicator is, because I think that'll help people kind of visualize this in their head. So let me ask you a question, which is, let's imagine you're having like a bad day, right? Like just terrible day. You come home after work, you're like, and you want to call someone because you know calling this person will make you feel better. Like you'll just like it. Do you know who you would call? Like, does that person pop into your mind?
Yeah, probably either Luke, my tour manager, or George, who is a friend and has been on the show 10 times.
Okay. So Luke and George are for you super communicators. And you are, I guarantee you, a super communicator back to them, right? You do it without even thinking about it. You just know how to you know how to ask the right question. You know how to show that you're listening. You know how to show that you care. You know how to, each of those things that you're doing with those two guys are skills. And you might not recognize them as skills right now because they just feel so natural to you, but they are skills. And once we identify them as skills, they become fungible. You can talk to a stranger the same way you talk to Luke. And if you do, it'll have the same impact that it has on Luke, which is that it feels like you're the most wonderful person on earth. Okay, so what are those skills? So one of the things that we know about super communicators, and this is the first skill, is that, and as I mentioned, we're all super communicators one time or another, but consistent super communicators, people who can connect with almost anyone, is that they tend to ask more questions, like 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And some of those questions we don't even register as questions, or things like, oh, what'd you make of that? Or like, oh, did you like that restaurant? Like little things that just invite us into a conversation. But some of the questions are what are known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks us about our values or beliefs or our experiences. And that can sound a little bit intimidating, but it's like as simple as like if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? It's as easy to ask the second question as the first, but the second question like invites them to talk about who they are. It's a deep question. It doesn't appear like a deep question, but it allows you to have a real conversation. So this is the first skill. Super communicators ask a lot more questions, and they ask deep questions. They ask about, instead of asking about the facts of someone's life, they ask how they feel about their life.
It's interesting thinking about the two guys that I mentioned, because they would both a lot of the time drop into that. And I think there's a sense of being seen when somebody asks you a question about how did that make you feel? Because at no point are they denying the fact that you felt that way or should have felt that way, that it feels like a judgment-free zone.
Totally. And the thing I love about that too, and I think that that's a really smart comment, because what it also recognizes is when I ask you about your personal experiences, I'm asking you about something that you are an expert on. And so let's say we're having a political debate and we disagree with each other, and I've got all my facts in my pocket and you've got all your facts in your pocket. But if I ask you, like, how did you feel on election day? Like when you saw the results come in, how did you feel? You're the expert in how you feel. I can't be like, oh, you didn't feel that way. You actually felt this way, right? Like, and then when you ask me how I felt, I'm the expert in what I feel. And so instead of us trying to out-expert each other and out-duel each other, we're both coming with these authentic experiences that we have. And it allows us to find all the things we have in common. Because if you voted for the person I didn't vote for and vice versa, my guess is actually that was the smallest part of that week, right? Was casting that ballot. There was also like waking up the morning after, there's taking your kids to school, there's, talking to friends about the election. Those are all things that we have in common. And finding that commonality really helps us also talk about what we don't have in common, which is really powerful.
Okay, next skill.
Okay, so first one is asking deep questions. Second skill is that once we ask those questions, we often think that it's just our job to listen to people. And that's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what listening is. So what's interesting is that most of the time when we think about listening, what we think about remaining silent, right? 2 ears, 1 mouth, remaining silent, listening to what you're saying. Maybe we'll nod our head. Maybe we'll like look you in the eyes and say like, that's interesting. That's not listening. That's the first condition of listening, but you need more to actually be a good listener. And in part, it's because particularly when we're talking about something that's really sensitive or really important or really controversial or something we feel conflict over, that we disagree with each other, there's always a sneaking suspicion in the back of our heads that you are not actually listening to me. You're just waiting your turn to speak. So what do I do to overcome that suspicion? Well, there's actually this technique. Let me give you the answer. The answer is that you have to prove that you're listening. You have to prove to the person you're paying attention. And there's actually this technique that they teach at like Harvard and Stanford and all these other fancy schools that's called looping for understanding. And this is what it is. There's 3 parts to this. When you're talking to someone and you get to that point in the conversation where like things are getting real, step 1 is you should ask a question, right? Preferably a deep question. Try and use that, ask someone, how do you feel about that? What does that mean to you? Why'd you decide to do X? And then listen to what they're saying in response. And when they're done answering the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. Now, the key here is it cannot be mimicry, right? This is what bad salespeople do. They just say back what you just said to them or the last thing that you said. What it has to be is you're trying to prove to them that you're actually processing this. So it has to be something like, what I hear you saying is this. And that reminds me of something you said last week because I think they're connected, right? You're proving to them that you're thinking about what they said. And most of us do these first 2 steps intuitively, right? This is just like, we kind of learn this in school. It's step 3 that I always forget, because once you've said to them, here's what I heard you say. Am I getting this right? Or you say, did I hear you correctly? You ask if you got it right. Because what you're really doing in that moment is you're asking for permission to acknowledge that you were listening. And when you acknowledge that I was listening, I become many, many times more likely to listen to you in return. This is basic social reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the second skill, is prove you are listening. Ask deep questions, prove you are listening through a technique like looping for understanding, or maybe just asking follow-up questions, or maybe saying, oh man, that sounds so hard. I kind of know what that's like. I've been through something myself. Prove you're listening. So third, sorry, go ahead.
No, just it makes an awful lot of sense that it can, bad conversations can feel like a game of tennis where everybody is just waiting their turn. Oh, the ball's coming over the net, it's coming over, it's going to bounce, and then it's my turn to hit it.
Yeah, and that's not fun, right? Like it's not like, and by the way, if you look at transcripts of great conversations, what you see is that they're a total mess. Like if you have a transcript and everyone's being really eloquent, they're saying things in like these really like practiced ways, that's not a great conversation. It might be a great transcript, but like if you were in that conversation, you'd be like, this is the most boring thing on earth. Like everyone's just waiting to hit the tennis ball.
Mm-hmm.
A good conversation is kind of messy and it has these non-linear aspects. And that's important. That's how we connect with each other.
What's the third skill?
Okay, so there's 2 more. The third skill is that you need to understand vulnerability and the role of vulnerability in a conversation. Because most people misunderstand what vulnerability is. This word has gotten used so much, we tend to think it means like crying on someone's shoulder or talking about like when your mom was mean to you. That's not what vulnerability is. Vulnerability has a very, very specific definition in neuroscience and psychology. And it's something that our brains have evolved to do, which is that when I tell you something that you could judge, it creates a sense of vulnerability in me. Now, I might tell you something where I don't care about your judgment. I might tell you that I like Star Trek better than Star Wars. I think it's a better show, better plots, better acting. And you could be like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like the Star Wars is definitely better than Star Trek. I don't care. I don't care if you agree with me. It's not like it's a high stakes thing. But the act of me telling you something that you could judge, it sets off a neural cascade in my brain that creates a sense of vulnerability. And here's what we know is that when I do that, if you don't judge me, if you choose to withhold judgment, and even more powerfully, if you share something about yourself that I could judge, then it is impossible for us not to trust and like each other a little bit more. Our brains literally have evolved to use vulnerability as a signal as to whether we should trust other people. And that doesn't mean that like I might agree with you. It doesn't mean that I might like think you'd be a good friend. But as once I am vulnerable with you and you are vulnerable with me, once we engage in reciprocal vulnerability and reciprocal authenticity, we will trust each other and like each other a little bit more.
Have you looked at this from an adaptive lens through?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you give me the?
Totally.
Yeah.
So let's talk about like why from an adaptive perspective, why communication is so important, why this particular trait might be even more important. So it's adaptive to be able to communicate, right? We know that societies do better than individuals. And the way that I can coordinate with a society is I can talk to them and we can share goals together. So communication is clearly adaptive. But then there's this question about like, why would vulnerability be something that's adaptive instead of maladaptive, something that helps us? And the answer is that once we build a society, it's very, very hard to police that society without it being really expensive. So if we have rules like you should not murder someone or you should not steal, and we have to get cops on every single corner to watch people all the time to see if they're stealing, it's incredibly expensive. It's not efficient. It undoes all the advantages of a society. So what we need some system where people learn the rules and they just want to live by the rules, right? They want to stick by the rules. And more importantly, if somebody breaks those rules, they take real offense at it. In a system like that, when a stranger comes to town, I have to determine whether that stranger poses a risk or not, because I can't follow them around with a police officer for a long time. And so one of the things that happens is if they show me something that I could use against them, if they show me their underbelly, if they admit something to me that I could judge, they're giving me a little bit of leverage. They're giving me a little bit of power. And that means, and if I do the same thing back to them, we've given each other some power. And in that situation, we don't have to worry about the police keeping everyone in line because you and I now know something about each other. We owe something to each other. We've taken the measure of the other person by giving them a chance to attack us. So if they're the type of person who's an attacker, we like gave them a perfect opportunity and they didn't do it. And that doesn't mean that like everyone in that society is going to be moral and ethical all the time. But it does mean that when I need to very quickly evaluate whether you're a risk or not, looking to the vulnerability and whether it's authentic vulnerability is going to be a real test. And there's another interesting part to this, which is when people aren't authentically vulnerable, we detect it almost immediately.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So like if I say like, hey, I just wanted to let you know, like, I spent all this money on this yacht and like, I'm a little stressed about like how much money I spent on it, but bro, it's a sweet yacht. Like that's clearly not me being vulnerable, right? I said something that
it's ostensibly,
a humble brag. It's a humble brag. I said something that you could judge. You could be like, yeah, you spent too much money, but like so that's inauthentic. Or if I ask you where you went on vacation, it doesn't take you long to figure out. I don't care where you went on vacation. I just want to tell you where I went on vacation so I can brag about like this cool safari I went on.
Mm-hmm.
our
Whereas
brains.
if you were to ask a question of, have you ever gone on a vacation and with your partner and it's been emotionally difficult? Have you ever had that?
Oh, totally. That's a great question.
That was something that happened to me recently, and dude, it's weird because you've got this sort of bittersweet sensation. You're away in somewhere that's so beautiful, but you and your significant other aren't really getting on, and I don't really know. I mean, is that common? Like, has that ever happened to you?
Oh,
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that's a fantastic deep question. Because what you just did is you admitted something vulnerable to me, and it didn't cost you much. It's not like I think like, oh, this guy's like such a jerk because he went on a vacation with his girlfriend. Like, there's no cost to that type of vulnerability, but it is authentic. You're trying to share something real and meaningful with me, as opposed to trying to like send some signal. And so we're very good at detecting authenticity BS.
Yeah, I think I've been pretty fascinated by parasocial relationships and the incentives for online writers, YouTubers, podcasters, influencers of any kind to try and growth hack or speed run this sense of relatability and authenticity and connection. And I think faux vulnerability, sort of performative vulnerability, maybe we could call it, is definitely one of the places that you see this happen. And, at its extreme, this is kind of victimhood pedestalization in some ways. Victimhood pedestalization tends to not actually happen from the person. It tends to kind of be bestowed on them by everybody else. In a way, you don't tend to pedestalize yourself as a victim. But yeah, that performative vulnerability, that sort of tuning up of things that didn't really affect you all that much, or maybe didn't really happen, or a surreptitious way of you getting gossip in, or maybe you're trying to vent to tell somebody something about someone else. Venting this. Have you looked into venting much as a adaptive mechanism?
Yeah, I've looked into office gossip, but not venting. Tell me about it.
Venting is so fucking sick. So venting is very much a female intrasexual competitive trait. And the reason is venting allows you to distribute gossip about a potential rival under the auspices of you being a caring compatriot. So I'm able to say, Charles, I'm really worried about John because he's just like, he's sleeping with. In fact, I'll pretend we're gonna be women. So I'm Christine and you're Charlotte. So Charlotte, I'm really worried about Johanna. Johanna's she's sleeping with all of these guys. And like, I'm really worried that she's going to get hurt, she doesn't really seem like she's being herself. And like, what am I, in that one sentence, what am I telling you? I'm telling you how much promiscuous sex Joanna's having.
Yeah.
I'm positioning myself as somebody who is, I would never do that.
I would never stoop that low.
Yeah.
I care about her so much. I have to bring it up.
Exactly. So like implicitly you're derogating her fecundity and her chastity whilst positioning yours above hers, but it's culpably deniable because you're not doing it to gossip. I wasn't gossiping.
Right.
Like, I'm just so worried, Joanna. I didn't mean to tell Charlotte, like I wasn't trying to like talk behind your back. I'm just so worried about you with all of this stuff. And venting, it's a very unique type of manipulative. It can be
totally
a unique type of manipulative sort of social.
And what's really interesting about that, and I think this is true of parasocialism in general, is
Lismans?
Parasocialism. Is that how we say it? Parasocialism. Yeah. Is that there is something authentic happening there, but the authentic thing is, I hate Joanna so much that I want to spread shit about her, right? Like that's actually an authentic thing. And so oftentimes when we see people who engage in performative vulnerability, it's very easy for us to say like, oh, if they're doing it for thousands of people, it must not be real. But of course, that's not true, right? Sometimes we say something to thousands or even millions of people, and it is very real. It's very authentic. The thing that makes the difference is are you committed to saying, first of all, do you know your own mind? Do you know your own feelings? Are you genuinely committed to trying to understand what you're feeling and thinking? And if that's like, I hate Joanna and I want to smear her, then like own that, live up to that, like accept that that's your goal. And once you do that, if you share it with other people in an authentic way, if you say like, look, like, I really want to tell 10,000 of my closest friends that like I have cancer and I'm terrified. That's not inauthentic. That's real. But it's real because the person thought about what they're thinking and feeling. They questioned their own motives and values. And then they tried to be as transparent with the audience as possible. They weren't trying to use any subterfuge. They're trying to say, I want you to understand me. So I'm going to speak to you in as clear and direct a way as I can.
I suppose there's, the yacht example is kind of interesting. It's almost like it's something which in the wrong hands, I guess vulnerability is something which is potentially destructive or embarrassing if put into the wrong hands. That might be one way to put it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, is that like I'm telling you something that actually you could use against me.
Yeah, but
right?
If you start spreading the rumor that I bought a cool yacht, that does nothing except for, make me seem cool. Okay, so that's okay. What's the final skill?
Okay, so the final skill is, once you're asking deep questions, once you're proving that you're listening, looping for understanding and sort of showing that, once you're willing to be vulnerable under the correct definition of what vulnerability is, it's really important that we pay attention to what kind of conversation is happening. I mentioned before that there's these three kinds of conversations: the practical, the emotional, and the social. And in the book Supercommunicators, there's all these stories about like a CIA officer who's like recruiting overseas spies, and why the Big Bang Theory became such a hit, because it was a flop when they made the pilot. And at the core of it is this thing that if I become attuned to diagnosing what kind of mindset you're in, if I can just ask myself, like, does this seem like he's in a practical mindset or an emotional mindset or a social mindset? And then I can just do the smallest thing to try and match you there, right? Like you mentioned that you went to your kid's graduation this weekend. And I say, instead of saying like, just congratulations, that's awesome, I say, oh man, what did that feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage? Because clearly this is kind of an emotional experience for you to go to your kid's graduation. I'm just going to ask about it. When we can pay attention, just the smallest amount, to what kind of conversation is happening, when we can match others and we can invite them to match us, all of a sudden our conversations get much, much better. And there's actually a scientific basis to this, which is because of, again, how our brains have evolved, because communication is so important to our species. When you're in a good conversation, like this conversation we're having right now, without us realizing it, our bodies start to match each other. So you and I are breathing at basically the same rate. Our heart rates are matching each other. Actually, even the dilation of our pupils is starting to mirror each other. And more importantly, if I could see inside both of our brains, what I would see is our thoughts are becoming more and more similar. Literally, we're using the same parts of our brain with the same type of energy. We're moving through similar neural pathways. And that kind of makes sense that our brains would become similar, because if you think about it, when I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually experience that emotion a little bit, right? Or if I tell you about an idea, you experience that idea. So it makes sense that our brains become aligned. But what the neuroscientists that I mentioned earlier have found, and there's a guy named Uri Hassan at Princeton who's kind of the grandfather of this research, is that the more our brains become aligned, the more we're thinking the same thoughts at the same time, the better we understand each other, the more we feel connected to each other, and most importantly, the more we like the conversation. Within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment. We become neurally entrained. And when we are neurally entrained, it releases this reward sensation, this cascade of neurotransmitters that make us feel good. And in part, this is adaptive because, our brains want us to communicate with people. They want us to have real conversations. They want us to connect and bond. And so when we feel good, even if we disagree with each other, we still feel good about the conversation. We still feel like the conversation was a success. Now, the thing is, these three types of conversations that I mentioned, they use different parts of our brains, right? So when I'm talking to my wife and I'm in an emotional mindset, I'm using the basal ganglia, the interior structures of my brain, And when she responds by giving me some practical advice, she's having a practical conversation, she's using her prefrontal cortex. So it's very hard for her thoughts to become similar if she's using the front of her brain and I'm using the interior of my brain. That's why matching each other is so powerful, is because literally what I'm doing when I ask you, oh, what did it feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage at graduation? What I'm doing at that moment is I'm activating the same part of my brain that I know is active in your brain. And it's going to make it so much easier for us to become neurally aligned. And then once we're aligned, we can move from emotional to practical to social and back to emotional all together. And we'll understand each other so much better the entire time.
Was this what the Dartmouth study was looking at? And that's something to do with a guitarist as well?
Yeah, there's a ton of studies that have looked exactly at this, right? Like you mentioned the Dartmouth study, they would have people watch these confusing movie clips together. And then they would actually turn off the sound, and they were oftentimes foreign movies. So the people were actually not even speaking English and there was no subtitles. And they would have people just watch these movie clips. They were super confusing. And they would put them in groups to try and have them answer a bunch of questions. Like, what's going on in that scene, X, Y, and Z. The group has to come to a consensus. And what they found is that some of the groups came to a consensus faster and easier than others. And when they put them in MRIs and they showed them the clips again, what they found was that those groups that came to consensus really, really quickly, and not quickly, but easily, fully came to consensus, their brains all looked like each other after they had this conversation. The first time they were watching the movie in the MRI, their brains all looked different, but the conversation somehow got their brains to look similar, to remember and watch these scenes as if they were all sharing kind of the same perspective. And so they're trying to figure out, why does this happen in some groups and it doesn't happen in other groups? And Bo Sievers is the name of the researcher who did this research. And what he found is that in the groups that came to consensus, in the groups that became neurally aligned, there was at least one person who was a super communicator. There was someone who would just ask a lot more questions than the average person. And again, a lot of the questions were like, oh, like, what did you think of that scene? Or like, oh, what'd you think of what happened next? They're just questions that invite us into the conversation. They would also do things like repeat what other people said a lot more often. Jim, you had a really interesting thought. You mentioned that you thought that this one scene was about death, right? They're proving that they're listening. And in that group, people begin modeling themselves after that behavior. So other people start.
It's so pro-social that it sets a tone everyone else wants to follow.
Absolutely. One super communicator in a group can cause everyone else to become neurally entrained. And when they're neurally entrained, they hear each other so much better. They like each other so much better. And that doesn't they had people in these rooms who were conservatives and liberals and people who were from the South and from the North. These weren't people who necessarily all naturally would have been friends, but just putting that super communicator in the room, having them model those behaviors, it made everyone else feel like that group came together, that it clicked. And that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's interesting how one correctly positioned person can sort of change the dynamic of a conversation. And I often think about I had this idea recently about why around some people it feels like we have so much to say, and around other people we don't feel that interesting. I'm sure that you'll have read the story about Winston Churchill's mother meeting.
No.
Have you not heard it? Oh, you're going to absolutely love this one. So I wrote about this in my newsletter a couple of weeks ago. So Winston Churchill's mother, I never realized, she was kind of a bit of a, how would you say, like a socialite type thing.
Okay.
Sort of a little like a Hollywood socialite type thing. She's called Jenny Jerome. So she got to dine with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone on consecutive nights. So there was the two rivals that were vying for leadership, and she got to dine with them on consecutive nights. And she said, when I left the dining room after sitting next to Gladstone, I thought that he was the cleverest man in England. But when I sat next to Disraeli, I left feeling like I was the cleverest woman. Yeah. And it sort of perfectly explains why around some people it feels like we have lots to say, and around other people it feels like we're boring. And I realized a lot of the time what people are want. They want to be charismatic. Gen Z even had to recreate it as Riz because charisma was too sort of boomery and uncool. And everybody wants Riz. But when you actually think about, okay, so how do you become charismatic, which is sort of energetic, outgoing, extroverted likability with sexiness, I guess. It's really hard. How do you make an uncharismatic person more charismatic? It's really difficult. But reverse charisma, which is not trying to be interesting to other people, but trying to make them feel interesting around you, that's way easier. That's significantly easier to do.
It's way easier. And there's this quote that I'm sure you've heard from Maya Angelou that no one remembers what you said. They only remember how you made them feel. And it turns out that the science tells us that's right. Like if you think back to a great conversation you had in the last week, and I would ask you to tell me what people talked about, you could probably come up with like 2 or 3 topics that came up, and you will remember nothing specific about what anyone said, right? Like when we're in a conversation, it's not like we're transcribing it. We're not paying attention to the words. Mm-hmm. What we are paying attention to. Now, if I asked you how you felt during that conversation, you'd actually be able to tell me with like surprising accuracy how you felt at different periods in the conversation. And you'd certainly remember how you felt at the end of it. That's what we tend to remember.
Yeah. I mean, Adam Mastriani has this great insight around everything is just vibes, basically, which is the same sort of realization you've come to. He's a guy who I think is still in academia. He did postgrad, he did a PhD, did all of this stuff. And I think maybe he did his undergrad 15 years ago, something like that. And he was on the quiz team, the quiz.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. I know Adam. I didn't know that he was on the...
Apparently. And he tested himself to just remember the names of the classes that he took in his first year of undergrad. Just the names of the classes. And I think he got 40% of the names of the classes.
Right. There's no way I would get 40%. I might get one of those, dude, right?
Yeah, exactly. But he said he can remember how one of the particular lecturers made him feel when he explained about some of the different. I think he threw a packet of Maltesers into the lecture audience, and someone caught them, and then he talked about prediction and prediction errors, and then he talked about disobedience and obedience when the guy threw them back when he asked, and he couldn't remember the name of the class, but he could remember the way that he felt. So one of the area, we've sort of talked about the deep conversations, something which a lot of people have a mortal fear over is small talk. The sort of awkward elevator, the water cooler thing, the sat waiting for whatever. How can people better survive small talk?
So this gets to these deep questions again. So I give a lot of speeches, right? I give speeches about, and it's usually like a room of say, 1,000 or 5,000 people who are like in a trade show. And so when I'm talking about super communicators, I always start it the same way. I say, in 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and ask and answer one question. And that question is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? And then I ask, like, who's excited about this? And literally no hands go up, right? Nobody wants to do this. They just came to some conference. They're at Vegas. And now here, this guy on a stage is telling them, I'm going to force you to like have a therapy session with this stranger who's sitting next to you, right? Nobody likes this idea. And then I spend the next 30 minutes explaining why this is a good idea, what we know about deep questions, what we know about neural entrainment. And then we do the experiment. And I ask people, and this is based on some work that Nick Epley, a professor at the University of Chicago, has done, because he's done this experiment thousands of times. And I ask people to estimate how much they think they're going to enjoy this conversation that they're about to have, right? How awkward they think it'll be, whether they're going to feel close to the other person. And when Nick does this, he actually has them take a poll on a phone. And what he finds is that people say before they have this conversation, this is going to be super awkward, right? Like, this is not, they actually say that they might enjoy it a little bit because, like, if you're sitting next to your boss, everyone doesn't mind hearing how their boss cried last time. So there's a little bit of voyeurism, but it's not a huge amount of enjoyment that they anticipate. And most importantly, they do not think they will feel closer to the person afterwards. They think they will feel even more distant from them because it's just weird to talk about crying with this stranger. So then, and I do this from the stage, We do it. You turn to the person next to you, spend 2 minutes asking and answering the question, then you switch places, spend another 2 minutes. The room like fills with this cacophony of noise. And then finally, if I can get people to shut up fast enough, I asked them what that experience was like. I asked them for a show of hands. How many people enjoyed that experience much more than you thought you would? Every single hand will go up. Because people are bad at estimating what a real conversation is going to feel like. So this gets to small talk. The problem with small talk is not small talk. The problem with small talk is the anxiety we feel when we go into it and the anxiety we feel about asking a deep question. And yet, again and again and again, if we ask that deep question, we will discover the other person loves to answer it. They want to hear us answer our own question. And we will walk away having enjoyed that conversation.
Well, I'm aware that a lot of people get worried about that level of opening up. I don't want to be seen as sort of too keen or too serious. That doesn't seem very fun. Doesn't seem very exciting. But fight the fight as a person that likes deep conversations, who likes small talk? No one.
Right.
No one likes small talk, regardless of what it is. And people are very publicly castigating of small talk as well. So it's the worst thing in the world. We're talking about the weather. Somebody brings up the weather and it's like, can you believe that's all that they had to talk about to do the thing? Okay, so practically.
But let's take the weather as an example, because you're exactly right that nobody likes small talk. But you don't have to ask that. If someone brings up the weather, you don't have to ask them the last time they cried in front of another person. You can say something like, it's really been rainy, and you mentioned like you don't like the rain. So I'm wondering, like, what got you to move to Seattle? Like why'd you move here since it's kind of a rainy place? Like, what was it about the city that you like? And suddenly, that's an easy question to ask, right? That doesn't seem like a deep question, but it actually is. Because inevitably that person is going to say something like, oh, I fell in love with someone and I moved here to follow them. Or I got this job opportunity and it just seemed so great, but then it didn't work out. And now I'm working someplace else. Small talk is kind of the word we use to describe boring talk. But you can transition almost immediately to something that's real and meaningful.
How can people better start deep conversations in a less awkward way? And how can people better receive deep questions in a less awkward way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this guy, Nick Epley, I mentioned, who basically he studies deep questions. Once a month, he'll get on a bus in Chicago and he'll sit down next to a stranger. And his goal is to ask that person about their hopes and dreams within 3 questions. And when he told me this, I was like, oh, this sounds miserable, man. This sounds like I don't want to do this. This sounds terrible. And he was like, no, it's the easiest thing I've ever done, because it usually only takes 2 questions. Like usually I sit down, I introduce myself and I'm like, hey, what do you do for a living? And they say, oh, I'm an accountant. And he goes, oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Was that your dream as a kid? And they say, no kid wants to be an accountant. Like I wanted to be an astronaut. But now suddenly he's like, oh, so what happened? Like, did you try and become an astronaut? Now they're actually having a conversation, right? They're talking about like, oh, I had kids and I had to raise them. And Nick can say like, I have kids too. I have 5 kids actually. And I know there's these challenges to raising kids. Now you're having a real conversation. So I think the way to start it and to respond is to ask something that you're actually curious about. When I ask you, where do you live? Basic small talk question. I do not care where you live. It is not something I'm actually interested in. Maybe it is, right? You live in Austin and I want to learn a little bit about Austin. But if I'm asking you something that's genuinely interesting to me, like why did you decide to move from the UK to the US? What was it about that? That's actually like really fascinating to me. That's something that could seem like a small talk throwaway question, but if I'm actually curious about it and I ask it with curiosity, we're going to be having a deep conversation within minutes.
You mentioned astronauts there. Didn't you look at NASA? Did you learn a bunch of stuff from NASA? What did you learn?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite stories from the book. So about 15 years ago, NASA started developing plans to build the International Space Station. And they realized that in addition to all the technical plans they came up with, there was actually this big problem that they needed to solve, which is up until then, about the longest NASA mission had been about 10 days in space. And they had basically realized you can send like the biggest jerk on earth up into space for 10 days and it's going to be fine, right? Like they're going to pick fights with their co-astronauts. They're going to pick fights with mission control. They're just going to be like a pain in the ass, but it's fine. It's only 10 days. But the thing about a space station is you're sending astronauts up there for 3 months or 6 months or 12 months at a time. And if you send a jerk into space for 12 months, he's going to drive everyone else crazy. So NASA realizes we need to start choosing astronauts, finding astronauts who have emotional intelligence. This is actually a lot harder than it sounds, though, because the problem for NASA is when you make it to the final rounds of an astronaut interview, you are awesome, right? You're handsome or you're beautiful. You have like 2 PhDs. And most importantly, you've been doing interviews your entire life. Like you know the right answers to every question. And what they realized is they couldn't tell the difference between the people who were faking emotional intelligence from the ones who actually had it. So they turned to this guy, Terry McGuire, the lead psychiatrist for manned spaceflight at NASA. And they asked him to come up with an interview question that will let them figure out who actually has emotional intelligence. And for 9 months, he works on this problem and he can't come up with anything. He tests a bunch of questions. None of them work. And then one night he's listening to recordings of old interviews with old candidates, and he knows which of those candidates went on to be really good leaders inside NASA and which kind of like washed out. And as he's listening, he realizes the really good leaders, they're laughing differently than everyone else in the interview. So he comes up with this whole new way of doing his interviews. Now what he does is he brings the astronaut candidate into a room. They're sitting there by themselves. He walks into the room and he's holding this big stack of papers and he trips as if on accident, and he spills the papers all over the floor. And then he laughs his big boisterous laugh. He goes like, I cannot believe I did that. And then he pays attention to how the candidate reacts. Because everyone reacts in one of two ways. Some people go like this. That's really silly. Let me give you a hand. And some people go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand. Everyone knows what's going on in that moment, right? You made a mistake by dropping the papers, and then you made the mistake even worse by overreacting, by laughing this huge kind of like inappropriately big laugh. Like we've all been embarrassed that way. And some of the candidates were like, oh, I'm just going to pretend this didn't happen. I'm going to just help you put this under the carpet. And some of the candidates were like, you know what? I know what you're feeling right now. Like I know that you're embarrassed. And the best way I can remove that embarrassment is I can jump in the boat with you. So I'm going to laugh this big boisterous laugh. I'm going to match you. I'm going to mirror your energy and your affect. Those were the people who had emotional intelligence, and those went on to be some of the best leaders in NASA's history. And it's all just paying attention to how they laugh in an interview that makes the difference.
Why do humans laugh? Did you look at this? What is it?
It's really interesting. There's a guy named Robert Provine, who's now passed away. He was at the University of Maryland. He actually studied laughter for years. He would go like to malls and restaurants and hide tape recorders so he could tape people talking to each other. And what he found is that about his initial thought was like, we laugh when we see something funny. And he actually wanted to figure out what like the science of funny was. But what he discovered was totally unexpected. He discovered that 80% of the time when we laugh, it is not in response to anything humorous, right? Like, you're not a comedian. I'm not a comedian. Our friends aren't comedians. And yet we laugh all the time. So what's happening when we laugh? When we laugh, we're oftentimes showing the other person, I want to connect with you. And when they laugh back, that same reciprocity that I mentioned before, and it's because it's a little bit vulnerable, right? Like if I laugh, I'm kind of saying like, I think that's funny. And you could be like, oh my God, you're such a jerk for thinking that's funny, right? So I'm showing you a little bit of vulnerability. When you laugh back, the most normal reaction, you're showing me that you want to connect right back. Laughter is how we forge connections with other people. The fact that we also do it in response to something funny is actually almost a byproduct. It's not the main function of laughter.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. What an odd sound that emanates from us. But I suppose that also explains why watching a recording of a stand-up set on Netflix in your house on your own versus going to a comedy club surrounded by 150 other people, the level of laughter is way different.
That's exactly right. Well, and there's actually I don't think someone told me this theory, and my understanding is it hasn't been proved out, but that there's some research behind it.
Oh, my favorite, my favorite place for a theory to sit.
Exactly.
As yet unproven,
Exactly. So,
and maybe to be replication crisis out of existence.
So if you're looking at a group of primates, there's a noise that they will make that means that there's like lion or a danger nearby, and that noise sounds like laughter. And so the theory is that laughter evolved because it's inherently prosocial. It's a noise that I make to warn others of danger. And most importantly, there's this huge sense of relief associated with it, because when I know that there's a danger out in the woods and I'm up in the trees, then suddenly like I actually feel a sense of relief because I'm not in danger. And so the theory is that this is why that weird noise has evolved, is it actually has these roots in this very prosocial behavior, which would also help us make sense that like oftentimes a joke is about building up tension and then saying something funny to relieve the tension.
That's interesting. What about when it comes to couples, potentially the most fraught, most important communication, the genesis of your story as well?
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
are the best and worst ways that couples communicate?
So there's a lot of in the book, there's actually like a whole chapter about the story that involves the growth of marriage therapy as a field of research. And one of the things that marriage therapists have found is that there's this one pattern that's basically disastrous. They call it kitchen sinking. So every couple fights. That's part of every relationship. Yeah, right. There's always like little disagreements or tension. But when some couples fight, a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything, right? So we start talking about like, where are we going to spend Christmas? And like within minutes, it's like, well, your mom hates me because like, and she's not nice. And by the way, if we earned more money, we'd be able to go to Hawaii instead of, right? So a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. Kitchen sinking, that is disastrous. That will make the fight toxic. And so researchers were trying to figure out, why does this happen? Because it happens pretty consistently, even to like couples that like are well matched. And they found that what happens is that when we're in a conflict, when I feel threatened, I want to control something. Like that's just a normal response, to find something to control. And the easiest thing for me to control is you, like the person I'm talking to. So I'm going to do things like I'm going to attack you back. I'm going to bring up your mom. I'm going to say things like, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to try and control what topics are allowed. If you're upset, I'll say things like, you shouldn't be upset about that. Like, that's a dumb thing to be upset about. I'm going to try and control your emotions. That's toxic. That's where kitchen sinking comes from. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is not to say you shouldn't try and control something, because everyone feels that impulse for control. That's very human. But instead of trying to control the other person in the relationship, try and find things you can control together. Like controlling, for instance, the environment. You start fighting at 11 o'clock at night. If one person says, look, I really want to talk about this. Can we wait until 9 tomorrow morning when we both wake up and we're not exhausted? Is that okay? Like now we're controlling the environment together. Or to say like, well, I want to control the boundaries of this conversation, to say like, let's talk about Christmas. Let's not talk about moms. Let's not talk about money if that's okay. Like, let's just focus on making a decision about Christmas. Now we're on the same side of the table. We're controlling the boundaries of this conversation together. And the reason why this is really important, why the best couples, it's not that they don't fight. It's that they fight and there's no lasting consequences of it. Because they're basically sort of teammates finding things to control together, even if they disagree with each other.
Where does that sense of teammatesness come from?
Well, because if you and I are controlling the environment together, we're on the same side of the table, right? Like we might disagree about like, how we should raise our kids, but we've both decided like, we're going to wait till 9 o'clock in the morning. We're going to do this together. We're just going to talk about whether like Jimmy's allowed to eat like snacks after 3 o'clock. We're not going to talk about like how you were raised and spanking and excellent, right? Now, suddenly we're kind of partners in figuring out like, what's our goal? How are we going to control this conversation together? And what's our goal in it? Now, the reason why I think this is really important is because it turns out the exact same thing happens online with social media. When social media goes bad, when people start screaming at each other, when social media becomes like a cesspool, it's oftentimes because people are trying to control each other, right? You make some argument. You say, I think guns are great. And I say, you're a moron. You're not even thinking about like all the guns that like kill kids in schools. Like, why are you a fascist? Like at that moment, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to control you. I'm trying to force you into a box. I'm trying to force you into the fascist box. I'm trying to force you into, you're thinking about Second Amendment, but you should be thinking about the kids. When we try and control each other on social media, it's very, very natural. It's very natural online because we're not seeing each other face to face. It can become toxic. But if we take a step back and we say like, look, like, I actually want to talk about this guns thing. Like, let's try and figure out like what aspect of guns are we talking about? Then an online conversation becomes just as good as any other conversation. And in fact, there's all these interesting studies done by someone, again, at Dartmouth, where he found that even just adding please and thank you, if one person in a thread says please and thank you, the tenor of the whole conversation improves. Because please and thank you is a way of me showing you that I want to share control with you.
As opposed to, I want to control you.
Yeah, as opposed to like, I'm powerful and you're a dick. And so like, let me try and control you as much as I can.
What do you think online discourse has done to our expectations of communication?
So it's a good question. Well, let me ask you, because you're online a lot. Like, what do you feel like? Do you feel like the conversations you have online, how do they compare to the conversations that you have offline?
I'm pretty good at posting and ghosting, so I'm not maybe the best avatar for someone who sort of gets into maybe the kind of interesting cantankerous style back and forth conversations that people are thinking of. I certainly know that it's done one thing which is pretty interesting, which is it's given people a sense of surrealness when the real world doesn't reflect the world that they expected from what they learned online. For instance, let's say that you are a successful young woman and you have moved up within your industry and have managed to get yourself to a place where you feel pretty sort of competent and well respected. And you keep hearing all of these stories online about how, women are oppressed and there's rampant misogyny everywhere. And you look at your own life and you struggle to see that. And you think, well, actually, to be honest, sort of being a woman's kind of helped me in many ways. I've been given opportunities that I'm not sure I would have been given if I was a man. But the way that the discourse is put forward online, the type of conversations that rise to the top, the ones that are the most inflammatory, obviously it's edge cases, right? Edge cases are exactly what garners the most attention. It's never the reliable woman who worked her way up step by step and didn't encounter any catastrophe along the way. It's the one that had an awful predatory boss who was making them do terrible things in an attempt to try and climb the totem pole. And rightly so, that's newsworthy because it's interesting and scandalous. But you lose the vast majority of the bell curve, like the boring bell curve, and you just get these edge cases. But I think what that leads to, or any other highly politicized topic online. You've seen this in surveys, right? When people are asked how many X type of people are shot by police every year, it's like 1,000%, 10,000%, 100,000% overestimations, because what is presented online and what is newsworthy, if it bleeds, it leads, doesn't necessarily represent what I think is people believe, like the number of people that get shot versus the number of people that die by cancer or something. And you're like, well, because people die by cancer every day and it's not newsworthy unless it's some celebrity or whatever. So we have this skewed perspective of how the world's supposed to treat us, how other people are supposed to see us, different social groups, different classes, different genders, different races, different positions within society. And then when we encounter evidence in the real world, which should be the most real thing that we have, that doesn't agree with what the online world told us that we should do, we end up in
dissonance
massively. And, I realized this when having a conversation with Freya India, who's on Substack. She does a blog called Girls, brilliant. And she was saying a lot of the time Gen Z gets sort of criticized for, well, the internet isn't the real world. And you say, these kids are spending 8 to 10 hours a day online. They may be spending twice as much time on the internet as they are asleep. The
Right.
internet is the real world.
Is real world for them. Yeah.
Yes.
No, that is the boundaries of your world. And so I think one of the things that's happening there's a researcher named Jay Van Bavel at NYU who's kind of looked at this phenomena, particularly on social media. And what he's found is that the problem with social media and the problem with online conversations is that oftentimes they highlight one aspect of identity very, very prominently, when in real life, that's one of many identities that someone contains, right? So the thing that we know is that, like, if I knew that you were Republican, I would assume a bunch of things about you, that you must be pro-gun, you must be pro-Trump, you must be anti-immigrant, right? And if you knew I was a Democrat, you would assume a bunch of things about me. I must be pro-trans. I must think Kamala is the greatest thing on earth. I must want to just tax everyone to death. Whenever we see someone described as by their label, then we tend to maximize what we assume their beliefs are into that label. Now, in real life, oftentimes, if I met you and I'm like, oh, I'm a Democrat, but we're at our kids' soccer game together, and you know that I'm also a journalist, and also I like to do model rocketry, and you and I ride bikes together, right? That one identity, I'm a Democrat. And there's so many other identities around it because all of us contain multitudes that it doesn't shape what you assume about me. Whereas when we are on Twitter and we go to our little thing, our little description in Twitter, it's proud to be part of the resistance, or January 6th was the best day ever. We're actually just giving into one identity. We're giving into one label, and it makes that conversation harder. Now, you asked, though, what's happening to our conversations as a result of this, right? With Gen Z spending all this time online, that the internet is their real world. So what I would say is this: there's actually a lot of room for hope. And the reason why is this story from about 100 years ago. So when telephones first became popular around the world, but also particularly here in the US, when phones first became popular, there were all these articles that appeared that said, no one will ever have a real conversation on the telephone. Because up till then, every conversation had happened face to face, right? And they were like, nobody will be able to do this on the phone. If you can't see the person and make eye contact with them, if you can't hear all the nuances in their voice, you're never going to have a real conversation. And what's really interesting is if you look at the transcripts from those early phone conversations, they were exactly right. People did not know how to use phones. They used them like telegrams. They would call up and they would say, here's what I need on the stock market. Or they call up and say, here's my grocery order. And then the other person would say, okay. And then they would both hang up. There was no back and forth. There was no give and take. Now, you fast forward a little bit to when you and I and everyone else listening was in middle school, and we could talk on the phone for 7 hours a night, right? We loved talking on the phone. And they were some of the most important conversations of our life at that point. And so what happened? What changed? What changed was we learned how to use telephones. And we learned how to use that technology. And what's interesting is when you are on the phone, you actually talk differently. All of us do. You will over enunciate your words by about 30% on the phone. You'll put about 15% more emotion into your voice than if you're talking to someone face to face, because you know subconsciously that they can't see you. You need to signal. So you actually learned a bunch of skills for phone conversations. Right now, we are living through a period of people learning skills for online conversations. And we're like that first 15 years after phones came out and became popular, right? It's a lot of screaming. It's a lot of mistakes, but it's from those mistakes that we learn. And Gen Z, I have 2 teenagers at home. I'm a dad. Both my teenagers, they know how to have real conversations over text. I don't know how to do that. They have emotional conversations with emojis. We don't need to despair for the future because we learn how to be good at communication, be good communicators. Our brains crave being good communicators, and they teach us how to do it.
Dude, awesome. Let's bring this one into land. What a great place to finish. I love it. I've been very much thinking about communication over the last few years, and I think an interesting element is how closely tied it is to our sense of self. That what maybe some people have got in the back of their mind is, well, it's all well and good you saying that I can work on my communication and I can build up these skills, but I don't want to be fake. I want to be me. And it's so funny how nobody attributes their natural God-given pickleball ability to them. And if I was to say, well, you went and got a coach, didn't you? And you improved your dink game and you improved your serve. But did you not want to have, your real, were you not worried about your real serve coming out?
Right,
like, what about that? You've lost it.
Your inner pickleballer. Like,
correct.
You've repressed them, right?
You've ruined it. Yeah, exactly. I started working with a speech therapist about 3-4 years ago, a diction coach. And one of the things that a bunch of friends said to me was, dude, you got to be careful. What if you totally lose all of the character, but nobody says that about, well, you're 270 pounds and, 28% body fat. And you go, but what about all of that beautiful fat that you've spent all of this time building up? You're going to replace it with this muscle? Really? Is that the real you? Is that muscle really you? And it's just odd, and when you see it, you can't unsee it. There's certain things that we have that are very tightly tied to our sense of self. Right? Our thought patterns, the texture of our mind, the way that we speak, the language that we use, the way that we enunciate. And there's other things that aren't, like our waistline. And when you confuse the two, you get into some pretty hot water.
You stop learning, right? You stop improving yourself because you assume that something is inherent or God-given or inborn or unmutable. And the truth of the matter is, all of it's just skills. Can I ask you a question, actually?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, on that. So, I mean, what's interesting about, so you moved here from the UK, right? You moved to the UK to the US.
3 years ago.
Still clearly a Brit. Like I doubt anyone bumps into you and they're like, oh, that guy grew up in Austin.
Yeah. Australia, I get accused of a lot, but yeah.
Okay. So do you feel like how you communicate, has it had to change since you've moved to the US?
A little bit, because well, the cultural waymarkers that you rely on, it's interesting being an immigrant, which I am, to a country that speaks the same language as you, because you forget that you're an immigrant. If I was in Mexico or Thailand, I would be permanently reminded of the fact that I'm not from there. People don't look like me. People don't sound like me. But you're snuck under the radar here. And it's odd because you're culturally displaced. If I want to use an example for a chocolate that everybody would have eaten as a kid, I can't really use Cadbury's because Cadbury's is a British brand. I can't really talk about Yorkshire tea or Newcastle Brown Ale or the in-betweeners. So I have to do this weird sort of projection, and I have to think, okay, what is the equivalent sort of ruminative thing that Charles knows that is the parallel of the thing I'm trying to use? So you have to sort of go around the houses quite a lot. There's certain sort of lexical things. We have an interesting difference with plurals versus you guys. So we would say Manchester United are having a bad season this year, whereas you guys would say Manchester United is having a bad season this year. Trash can, sidewalk, little bits and pieces like that. But I just sort of, I don't know, it's becoming more natural to me. And maybe this is what going native is like, and I'm going to have a Texan twang within the next few years. Who knows?
Well, and what I love about this going native aspect is that, like, it's actually like what your brain was created to do, right? Was to make it easier and easier and easier for you to communicate. And my guess is if you went back to the UK, you would slip right back into mentioning Cadbury and the pluralizations. And if I moved there eventually, I would too. And I'd start saying lift and boot. And our brains are amazingly versatile when it comes to communication. And a huge part of it is just giving it the skills that it needs, and then thinking about this and working on it and being willing to experiment and practice. And then we become super communicators.
I love it. Dude, so good. Where should people go?
Thank you so much.
Up to date with everything that you do and write and talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I have a Substack, if people want to come sign up for my newsletter, it's called The Science of Better. You can find a sign up for that on my email or on my website, which is charlesduhigg.com, Duhigg. Or if you just Google The Power of Habit, which was the first book I wrote, or Supercommunicators, you will definitely find my website. And actually, I have my email address on my website. And I will say, I read and respond to every single email I get from a reader. So
you may regret that after this episode. But
sometimes it takes me a little while.
Go forth, my pretties, and destroy his inbox.
But I would love to hear from folks. And if you do want to buy a copy of Super Communicators, you can find it at Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, and most importantly, your local bookstores. So
heck yeah. Charles, I appreciate you. Until next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
Do you think that your algorithm on YouTube is a bit of a god? Is it able to know things about you that you don't know about yourself? Well, the YouTube gods have selected this episode specifically for you, bespoke. So go and check it out.